Hello guys, and welcome to my character customization video part 2, where we're going to be focusing on skill points this time and how to spend them in accordance with the weapons that you have. So if you feel like you're not entirely sure where you should be putting all these points, this is the video for you. But before we get started, remember, click the like button, click the subscribe button and that little bell so you don't miss anything. Right, now getting started into the video, let's bring up our character, and the first place, or the first thing we should consider when spending skill points is what weapons you're going to be using, because that really governs if skill points are going to be used efficiently or not. So let's first take, for example, the heavy bolter. The most important things you need to be aware of when you've got a weapon equipped is what damaging types it has. So you'll see here for ability number 1 we have channeled, fleshbane, spread, high suppression. If we skip to 4 we have area, channeled, knockdown, shock. So you need to take a note of these, and when you're spending skill points thereafter, this is entirely relevant, because for example, if I spend something now on stun abilities and I don't have a stun based attack, it's pointless. Let's see what I've spent for this guy and I'll explain to you why I've done this. So you'll notice I've got a shock ability on number 4, so therefore I've invested into shock duration for some of these on the debuff tree. As well as that, if we go over to here we go. Now you'll notice we've also put some points into doing extra damage to characters while they're shocked. So that the theme of this build thus far is applying a shock, which slows an enemy and their attack speed, and then doing more damage to them 5, 10, 15, 20% as well, which is quite effective. You'll notice for these skill trees I've not gone into the maximums of any of them to get the final skill point. I actually don't think that's particularly necessary at this point in the game. I don't think wasting a lot of points to get to this one ability is really worth it. If you're used to playing something like World of Warcraft, often your build is entirely all about this ultimate ability which you work towards. That's the key to your build. In this game, really not the case. I would have to waste a lot of points on other things that would be irrelevant to my weapon in order to get to that. So I think we should really be spending points a little bit more wisely. Now, to run through a couple of the really good abilities that I think are very relevant to all of the classes, let's run through a couple of them and just give them a little review. So the first one is this: reduces cooldowns by 1 second when the character is hit. So when you take damage, your skill cooldowns that have a cooldown of greater than 3 seconds are reduced by 1 second. So there's a lot of abilities in this game that have a cooldown of about 4 or 5 seconds. This is a pretty significant reduction to that. Now, the Venom Toxin Mastery tree. Firstly, I don't think Toxin Synergy is working currently. It's a nice idea because dots do stack on enemies. However, I don't think this is currently working, but when it is, I think it will be worth it. However, what you have to remember is all of these points being spent into dot damage at the moment. Even if you go plus 50% dot damage, it's still not a lot of damage at the moment. I don't think this tree is really worth it, although some of the extra effects from it are quite good. So the extra 20% damage penalty, for example, if you're trying to tank a Dreadnought in melee, that reduces their damage by 20% while poisoned. So if you've got some Death Cult blades, that's perhaps even for 3 points to get to that, absolutely essential. Other ones that I think are really worth noting: reduced reload times on weapons like snipers, etc. Incredibly good and incredibly helpful, because, well, you don't want to be sat there for 3 seconds reloading if you don't have to be. Up here as well, I do think this one's often overlooked and people don't use the cover system as much as they should, but 30% ranged skill cooldown is incredibly powerful. If you're behind cover and clearing mobs and you've got a 10-second cooldown, 30% off of that, that's 3 1/3 seconds off of that. That's a pretty impressive change. You've got to remember as well, in this game, you're not spending a resource as such. You might be spending ammunition or heat, but it is infinite, so it's worth remembering that you can spam abilities pretty freely at the moment. Now, 10% extra range damage to enemies when there's no one around you is also pretty good. If you're doing a good job of kiting, I think that's pretty reasonable. As well as that, if you're going for some opening ranged aimed shots on characters, 10% damage can't really be knocked. And also for kiting, I think hit and run is pretty good, but again, it has to be a burst skill. So you have to look through your weapons and see, is this a burst skill? If it is, 10% movement speed is actually quite substantial. This really helps with your kiting. Now, there are others that are pretty good too that you should sort of be looking out for. If we have a little skim through, we'll just try and find a couple more that are pretty good. I have to say, I think the final critical hit tree skill, this is probably the only tree I would spend every single point into, because the last one is incredibly good. You've got a 10% and potentially stacking 10 times, so basically doubling your damage if you manage to get enough critical hits that will kill an enemy. And if you're clearing trash, a critical hit probably will kill an enemy. This is a really nice one for increasing your damage. And the best thing about this tree is there's not many wasted skill points within here. Everything revolves around your critical hit, so you've got chance, damage percentage, chance and chance again, and the rest of these give you a bonus on each critical hit. So I do think you can't go too far wrong with this tree. The only downside, though, is that you get critical hit with melee weapons over here with a couple of points, and over there will be ranged weapons. So in every tree there are redundant points if you're maxing it out, which is something I don't really like at the moment, but hey, it's how they've got it built into the game. Some of the tanking ones are fairly good as well. I get 600 hit points just by spending a few points in here, which I think is pretty good. Field surgery I also think is very, very good if you find yourself getting into tight situations. Resetting your inoculator cooldown is incredibly helpful, especially if you've gone for one that has a very high cooldown. So this is something really worth taking into consideration. Now what I'd like to do just before we finish up is run through another weapon with you, another potential scenario. What we'll do is we'll equip a couple of bolt pistols. We'll just run through another hypothetical with those. So let's have a look here. We've got armor breaking on these guys. So what we'll do now is if we go over to skills, it's worth pointing out, by the way, the first ability has armor breaking. If you look at the others, it doesn't. So you do have to take into account what moves you're using as to which skills are going to benefit them. But if we look at the basic auto attack, armor breaking. So now we go over to skills, and if we go over to the debuff tree, you'll see down here 3% damage bonus to armor breaking, so we can do that twice, 3, 4 times, which is 3, 6, 9, 12% extra damage for your base auto attack from 4 points. It means you're going to be building towards using your auto attacks a little bit more. Yes, you'll have to pick this up in the meantime, but that's just some extra suppression damage to it, which is pretty good. And then we've also got 20% damage penalty for knockback or knockdown, which is kind of irrelevant to the single target ability, but basically what I'm saying is you need to look at your weapon, you need to see what is on my weapon and how can I make the best use of this. There's loads of ways to build these characters. If I wanted to, I could build this weapon around suppression. I could build it around critical hit for the aimed strike with a little bit of cooldown, because you get a plus 20% critical hit with the aimed strike abilities. It also stuns the target for 2 seconds, so you could even work around the stun ability. But what you need to make sure you don't do is get into a habit of making your skill tree and then changing your weapons, because any time you change a weapon, really, half of your skill tree is probably going to become redundant. So that's something just to really take care of and take mind of. What I'd suggest you do every time you change a weapon is you look and see what abilities you've got. I know I'm repeating myself here, but this really is important to understanding the game, how to get the most out of it, and say, what can I do to maximize the effectiveness of this weapon? How do I want to build the weapon, and how do I want to play around it? There's loads of potential builds for each weapon. There is not one correct answer. Most people will probably move towards the, let's say if you're a ranged character, going for the straightforward skills of just doing ranged crit or ranged damage. But remember that the 4 abilities for each weapon do have other stats as well tied to them, so you can still get a lot of extra damage out of that. As well as that, just remember there's some really good abilities like this inoculator cooldown, like the 1% cooldown you also get in the suppression tree. There's some really good stuff elsewhere. And remember, just as a summary again, guys, don't feel like you have to max out every tree. I personally feel like that's a waste of stat points at the moment. You really want to mix and match based on the weapon you have. And something else to consider, which makes this even more confusing, is the fact that you get 2 weapons. But don't worry guys, we're going to have 250 skill points, so eventually we'll be able to max out quite a lot. But of course we're only in the early days of the game at the moment, so obviously we're not going to be maxing to level 250 with our character just yet. Guys, hopefully you found that a little bit useful and educational, and you feel a little bit better equipped in order to make your character awesome. Have a great time in the game. Feel free to leave any suggestions down in the comments as to what videos you would like to see from me. Anything you'd like help with, anything you'd like advice with, hit me up. That's what I'm here for. Guys, have a great weekend. Take care.